Doesn't life require compromise? This is the title of an article from the book The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand. In her explanation of this question, she speaks about the ideal of a compromise versus the reality of how most people view a compromise. According to Rand, a compromise is an adjustment of conflicting claims by mutual concessions. She asserts that a compromise must be fair and demonstrates this with the scenario between a burglar and property owner. She states that there can be no compromise between a property owner and a burglar, as there must be a total surrender because someone walks away with nothing in return for having chosen a side. In this scenario, there is no middle ground. She further explains that desires have moral validity, and the only way to get along is by compromising, a profit and loss situation, no matter how it plays out. Rand's view of compromise is very thought-provoking. Her complex disposition of a compromise is very well represented in the article, which makes it difficult to fully reject or accept all of the claims. The following is a summary and critique of the most interesting claims and views that she has asserted.
In the article, Rand states that a compromise occurs when a decision is mutually made to alter opposing claims. However, within this compromise, both parties must have a valid claim, and B, some source of value or concession to exchange, which occurs as a result of an agreement on a fundamental principle for this exchange to operate upon. For example, when purchasing a can of carnation cream from a store, the fundamental principle is financial trade. If the specifics of this principle were adjusted, for instance, if the buyer desired and receives a lower price for that cream, after negotiating, this would still be considered a compromise. However, the author states that if anything outside of the specifics of this fundamental principle are negotiated, it is no longer considered a compromise, but instead the surrendering of oneself to the other party or the complete abandonment of one's moral principles. To her, this would be like attempting to compromise life and death, truth and falsehood, or reason and rationality. Rand suggests that this is what is usually regarded as a compromise today, and states that this is in fact immoral. She attributes this modern-day description of compromise to ethical subjectivism, which means that people are entitled to have what they desire. All desires have the same level of validity, and that this manipulation of the word compromise is the only way that men can get along.
Rand questions the concept of compromise and asserts that arguments which may seem like compromises are actually forms of wish fulfillment. According to Rand, it is false to define a compromise as a breach of comfort, as it is actually a breach of one's convictions. Essentially, it is the abandonment of one's integrity by doing something which one knows to be evil. An example of the Randian definition of modern-day compromise would include conforming to social pressures by pretending to be a follower of a particular religious doctrine to avoid being chastised by religious authority. The pretense of religious observance is the act of compromise. Other examples of compromise similarly go beyond the mere inconvenience of doing something that you dislike. Pretending to agree with another's ideas to save face when you know the idea is faulty is compromise. Or making changes to a manuscript as suggested by a publisher solely in order to gain their favor or that of the readership is compromise. The rationalization on using such ideologies, according to Rand, is that the compromise is temporary and at some indefinite future point, one's integrity will be regained. This is a fallacy, according to Rand, as the initial lack of loyalty to one's own convictions won't make it easier, but will virtually eliminate the possibility of reclaiming their integrity. Patterns will have been made that cannot be easily changed.
Being able to compromise is a tool every individual should possess. Based on Rand's article, the following aspects discussed below support and reject Rand's view on compromise. First, Rand mentions that persons compromising must have valid claims and some value to exchange. Both persons should be willing to give up a coveted want to close a disagreement. Compromise is all about give and take. On the contrast, the general proclivity of a compromise has been the abandonment of one's fundamental principles or moral convictions. A compromise that requires this is, to simply put it, unethical. An unethical compromise is not a compromise at all, but a complete surrender of one's own moral convictions. There can be no compromise if only one person is willing to meet the other halfway. Carrie Minkle Meadow from the University of California states, it may, in fact, be unethical, immoral, or at least ill-advised not to compromise in many circumstances. They also continue that at the most pragmatic level, there would be no family relationships, legislations, governmental policies, economic relations, or international treaties had there not been some process of trade and bargain for exchanges, which mostly include conceding something to one another for the benefits of that agreement or relation. They continue by stating that further communication and exploration of everyone's needs and interests doesn't have to be conflicting, but produce an ideal solution where no one gives up anything. Rand's view on compromise shows that both or all parties involved in the compromise will and should benefit from it if it is performed in the correct way. Compromise can be immoral. As such, Rand's statement that there can be no compromise on moral principles can be generally agreed upon, assuming that compromise should be a deal made on the basis of a mutual agreement on some fundamental principle, rather than the total loss of one's integrity. According to Golden, as stated by Nachi, there is no set of necessary and sufficient predefined conditions that could simply be fulfilled in order for a compromise to be achieved. Compromise ventures onto immorality when an individual's fundamental principles, such as integrity and humanity, are dismissed by others to make things easier or to appease an individual or a particular situation. The ability to regain one's integrity is a fallacy. If one is always compromising, abandoning their beliefs, or instead giving in to others' reasoning, it allows one to lose sight of themselves. In some ways, then one should never compromise their integrity. One can see how this view can be agreed upon from the perspective that giving up one's integrity is a breach of conviction. It can be inferred from her view that Rand is against altruism, which is all for putting the welfare or happiness of others and their goals before one's own. This view is supported in Rand's statement, which reads, if one found it difficult to maintain one's loyalty to one's own convictions at the start, a succession of betrayals which help to augment the power of evil one lacked the courage to fight will not make it easier at a later date, but will make it virtually impossible.
However, Rand's view on compromise can also be considered immoral or unethical. Firstly, her definition of compromise is subjective. Rand states that a compromise requires a valid claim. However, what is considered valid cannot be objectively determined across the board. What may be considered a valid claim to one person may be considered invalid to another. For example, as Lacasau and Sunderville state in their article, are utilitarian deontological preferences unidimensional? A deontologist believes that there are moral rules that do not change based on the situation. An utilitarian believes that good should be maximized and bad should be minimized. There will be some situations where someone with utilitarian views and another individual with deontological views may disagree on what they both consider a valid claim due to their ethical philosophies. Furthermore, in many scenarios in Rand's article, there are signs that compromise may be one-sided. This creates an inequality which breaks the rules of the moral theories. A person involved will always have to yield in some way to allow for others to receive what they want in a compromise. As individuals, if we are supposed to bring about what is right, or a result of good or bad as stated in deontology and utilitarianism, We are to ensure that both parties receive equal the amount of exchange value instead of one individual receiving more than the other. Another claim in Rand's article that cannot be fully accepted is that of the regaining of one's integrity becomes virtually impossible through this use of the term compromise. This point argued by Rand would be difficult to fully accept, as one can argue that it is dependent on the severity of the circumstances of the compromise to whether an individual is able to regain their integrity or not. For instance, Jeffrey Dahmer, a prolific serial killer responsible for the deaths of several men, rejected the moral view of compromise for an immoral, even sinister viewpoint of the practice. Dahmer provided claims of money to his victims in exchange for photographs. However, his real claim was to take the lives of his victims, which led to him not being able to regain his integrity. If the persons participating in compromise have immoral claims, it would be difficult for them to regain their integrity. However, if an individual's action within a compromise is deceptive instead of immoral, they would be able to regain their integrity in the future. For example, if a person sold a car to another individual but failed to provide vital information to the buyer about the car, they would be able to regain their integrity as there is a difference in the claims.
So the question remains, is compromise ethical? The discussion of Rand's assertion shows that compromise is only ethical when there is a mutual or fundamental agreement that influences the decisions to be made. The reality is that a compromise is not merely a system of equality, but instead one of equity. And from the outside looking inward, one may never know the intrinsic value of a compromise to the parties involved. The decision to compromise is subjective to each individual and agreement. Only when a compromise is unethical, which again, based on Rand's assertion, requires someone to abandon their own convictions and morals, it is seen as unethical. It seems that, according to Rand, the only compromise that can truly exist is an ethical one. And the reality is that if someone was not forced or coerced into a particular position, it is in fact an ethical compromise because that person chose that position. And perhaps for that reason, that decision was the one that produced the most good for the individuals making the compromise.